Hey, what's up everyone, welcome back to another Sims 4 video on my channel. In today's video we're building a base game Victorian style house. So when I started building this I thought it would be a quick build and a rather short video, but it got a little bit out of hand, and even though the house is not that big, it took me quite long to finish it just because I wanted to get as many details in there as possible. So for those who are new to the channel, my builds are usually play tested and fully functional, and this house is no exception to that. If you want to play with it, you can download it. And as I said before, I didn't use any packs, so this house is fully base game, so you don't need anything to download it. No custom content used, even though I plan on using some custom content in the future, as I said in my previous videos. But for this house, you don't need anything, just base game. Personally, I really like using just base game for builds because you have to make use of what you have and try to overcome limitations by being creative. For example, we have no climbing trellises in base game to my knowledge, so I used some debug fences and other debug objects to build my own trellises, which we'll see later on in the video. So here I was trying to figure out what windows to use, and base game has some really nice windows in my opinion, which I use a lot also for non-base game builds just because they look very nice. I like the shutters here. So this is my first Victorian style house. I've never built one of these before, so I'm not sure if I got it right. Let me know in the comments below if you think it looks Victorian or not, but this is just my personal interpretation of what I know from reference pictures and what I could use from base game to build one of these. I mean, I looked up Victorian style houses on the internet and also did my research on the specific features of this type of build. For example, we have the bay windows here, and also there's usually a tower-like structure which we have here in the front. But again, this is just my personal interpretation of this type of house, and I hope you guys like it anyway. So as you can see, I used T.O.O.L for this build to adjust my objects here, resize them, lower them or elevate them. It's just a very useful mod. I'm gonna link it in the description below just in case somebody's new to the channel and wondering what this is. So the main idea for this build was to have a rather plain house. As you can see here, we have a lot of gray, not that much color. Also the roof is black, and we have these smaller kind of fish scale shingles here, and as a contrast I wanted to have a very colorful blooming garden area. As you can see here, I started placing the first bushes here, and I initially didn't plan that this house should be completely overgrown, so overgrown came later, but I think it's now the defining feature of this build. It's for a person who's really into gardening, and the goal was to create a garden that looks natural but also kind of wild, but not in a neglected way. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of lawns or gardens that are too manicured because they usually look very artificial, and it's just not what I prefer. I mean, for specific builds, I think this is the way to go, because especially for more modern houses you want to have a lawn that's not too wild or overgrown. But I think for builds like this one here, it makes sense to have a lot of flowers, and other plants just have more plants in general because it's in the countryside, and also because the plants are kind of the defining feature for this build. As I said before, we have the overgrown Victorian. As you can see, we also have a greenhouse to the right side here, which I added a bit later on in the video. I wasn't too sure if I wanted it here because I initially planned to have a greenhouse, but I wasn't sure if there was enough space. And as you can see here, I wanted to do some kind of custom sliding door. I used these base game windows, of course, because this is a base game build, and tool mod to place them. As you can see here, this looks kind of nice in my opinion. I really like it. So we have this open door here. By the way, if you want to use this in your gameplay, you can of course remove the door and simply place the windows if you don't want the open door here, or you can use the windows and place them in their initial position so the door is covered, and this way it kind of looks like a shut sliding door, which you can do if you have, for example, seasons, and if it's getting colder you can close the door, because it doesn't make sense to have an open door when it's snowing outside, for example. But for this build I wanted to keep it open just because I think it looks very nice, and it's also a bit of a feature. So here you can see the climbing trellis I was talking about earlier. To build these trellises, I used fence posts and these kind of overgrown fences here, which already have a very nice, overgrown texture. We have some plants on them, which I think looks very nice, so I like using them for this purpose. But you can of course use them for many things, for example as a fence, which I think would be quite straightforward because they are fences. I also used some planks from debug, so you have to enable your debug by using cheats or by downloading the bb.buildby mod, which I'm also going to link in the description below for those who are new to the channel or want to try it out. It's a very useful mod I like to use a lot. That kind of rhymed, and I like to use it because it just helps you with like organizing your objects, your debug objects in particular, because if you don't have the mod, they are all over the place. And as you can see here, the mod sorts your objects into the regular categories of, for example, trees and flowers and rocks, and it's much easier to find what you're looking for once you get used to it. So I really recommend checking it out. There are also videos out there, not on my channel but on other channels, on how to use this mod. By the way, let me know in the comments if you want a tutorial on how to use BUILDBUY and or T.O.O.L. So at this point I was adding our first real flowers here, as you can see, and I placed them here just because I wanted to have an overview of what I wanted to use here. So these are my top picks for this build here. As I said before, I want this to be very colorful in terms of plants, just because the house is mainly white and gray and black, so it looks like a bit of a grayscale picture. So I use the plants here as a contrast, which I hope you guys like as much as I do. So this part here of the video is kind of unnecessary because I built this fence here, which didn't make it into the final build, and I wanted to show you guys what I did here. And because the fence is in the video for a while and otherwise it's a bit confusing, I used these stone walls here and the metal lattice fence to kind of build a custom fence. I also cut out the rest of the building process for this fence here, just because it's kind of obsolete. It took very long, and also I ended up removing it, so it's not really necessary to keep it in the video. But it would be interesting for me if you could tell me in the comments below which of the two fences you actually prefer. There's not that much difference, just where the fence goes, and I also switched out the fence posts, so it looks a bit different. But I preferred the second one, and I'm just curious what you guys think about this one here. So today's video is also a bit longer, and I hope you guys don't mind because I don't want to make them too fast. I said this in a different video before. If it's not fast enough for you, I would recommend to simply adjust the speed. I think I don't talk that fast, so you could still have the commentary if you wanted, or simply mute the video and use different music for it, whatever you prefer, because some people told me they don't like my commentary, but I'm gonna do it anyway for those who want commentary on the channel, so that's not an issue here. I just wanted to say thank you to one of you guys. A few days ago I got a suggestion telling me to simply cut out unnecessary steps in landscaping, for example, because this would help make my videos a bit shorter, which I did, and it actually helped a lot, even though this video is still very long. I also thought about splitting this video in half, so have 2 uploads, but I didn't like the idea, and I also asked you guys once if you want videos cut in half, but you told me, or the majority told me, to keep them longer and just have one long video. So as you can see here, I started working on the second draft of the fence here, and I felt like the fence should be a bit cleaner, if that is the right word. It looks a bit cleaner in my opinion now. And I also used T.O.O.L mod here again to lower the metal fences into the stone wall and into the ground, just because they were a bit too tall. And as you guys can see here, I also replaced our stone fence posts here with a kind of custom one where I used 2 fence posts which I shoved into each other to make them a bit taller, so they line up with the fence posts next to the gate here. I think this custom fence here fits the overall aesthetic of the build much better than the first one, and also better than a wooden fence. Again, let me know in the comments below which of the fences you prefer. I also wanted to have some variation around the house, so here we have just a stone wall and not the metal fence, just because I think it looks a bit better with the flowers to the left, which kind of grow in between the patio area here and the stone wall. I also added this statue here as an eye catcher. I think it looks very nice here in front of the climbing trellis and all the flowers. Also a small bird bath here, and we have a small functional gardening area here with some different planter pots. We have a square one and a round one here, and I simply added some debug objects around it for some extra detail, of course. As you can see, we have also some wooden planks ready to kind of frame certain parts of the build here, just to give it a little extra detail. I also used some terrain paint here because I feel like the natural color of most lots is a bit too uniform or strange looking. Some of a strange texture looks like a kind of leaves, which I don't really like, so I usually use a lot of terrain paint. And for this video, I only kept the most important parts where I use terrain paint because I feel like it's not very interesting for you guys to watch me do this, especially because I use a very light brush most of the time, which takes much longer to apply but looks a bit more natural. So as you can see, I extended the fence a bit more to the left and also added this same stone fence posts here that I have in the front and extended it all the way to the back. In the back there's actually a different fence again, just to make it a bit less uniform, which I think is very fitting for this build here. And I also used tool mod here, of course, because we had to lower the metal fence into the ground here, so it's in line with the rest of the fence. So I also started to add some more plants here because this kind of looks like a planter pot, or at least something that's intended for plants. And as I wanted to add more plants to the exterior anyway, this came in very handy. And at this point I also wanted to add this staircase, because what I usually forget to do is with multi-story buildings is to add a staircase or ladders. And for builds like this, I feel like ladders are not very fitting because most houses don't use ladders. And an older looking house like this one here would certainly not have a ladder to the first floor, in my opinion. I used the ladder to get to the top of the tower just because it wasn't possible any other way. So we have the ladder here, but for the rest of the house I wanted to use a staircase, so I basically used only one staircase, so because we have only 2 stories to connect, so basically we only need one staircase, and I didn't even keep it there because it was kind of in the way, which you will see later on in the video. So here I added a small additional balcony which is connected to the tower on the back side, so you don't see it from the front. And I also added a telescope there, so we have this very nice observation area here, just to add some additional activities for your sims. So the area to the left here was a bit plain, and I wanted to add a fountain somewhere, and I feel like this is a perfect spot for it. And I wasn't too sure how to connect different pathways here, because we have the gravel in the front, which I don't really like. I think it's nice as a foundation, but not really to use it in the way I used it here as a pathway, just because it has no real texture. It's just flat. And I also ended up removing it here around the fountain, just because I found a better solution for this area, at least in my opinion. And once I made my own gravel for my modern contemporary mansion thing that I built a while ago. It was probably my biggest build until this point, and you can download it from the gallery if you want to. It's an old video, so it's not very good. But for the build, I basically made my own gravel by sizing down regular stones and make small pebbles out of them. It was really tedious work. You can't see it because the video is a stop motion, but it took very long, and I think I placed hundreds of stones, which was really not that great of an idea because it's a rather big build anyway. I built in one of the biggest lots in the game, and I used lots of objects, and it didn't help performance wise to place hundreds of different small stones there. And I think if your computer isn't that good, it will probably not be very pleasant to play with this house, just because you most certainly will have frame drops even with a stronger computer. So for this build I simply used the terrain paint gravel and tried to cover up the edges to make it look a bit more natural. So moving on to the interior here, I wanted to furnish the greenhouse more like a living room area or a reading room. So we have a lot of plants here, and I also added a chair to sit here and read. But we also have plants, of course, and an easel so you Sims can paint here. There's also a door separating the greenhouse from the rest of the house, which you can remove if you don't want it here. I would recommend simply deleting the wall or use the same arch I used for the sliding door, for the custom sliding door that leads to the patio area here, in case you want this area to be more open. But it basically separates the dining area and the kitchen area from the greenhouse. I also ended up removing the door in the back. You can see here next to the staircase, just because I needed the space for the kitchen area, and this was not a very good floor plan, so I switched up a lot of things here to make it more convenient and less weird looking. So one thing I really hate about building in The Sims is that you can't rotate staircases or modify them if there are walls in the way, even if you don't plan on placing them here. So usually you have to move the staircase outside of your house, and sometimes certain objects, especially windows and doors, will stick to the staircase and will be moved once you place the staircase somewhere else, which is really annoying for building. I think staircases are one of the worst thing in the game, and there are many things that need to be fixed. For example, we need diagonal staircases. I like to build on diagonals just because the houses look better, in my opinion, also on the gallery and for screenshots, which is kind of necessary for me as a builder. And it's kind of infuriating that we don't have diagonal staircases at this point, because the game is quite old and it doesn't seem like such a big deal to add diagonal staircases. Same goes for ladders. I want to be able to place ladders on diagonals because I very often build small houses on diagonals, and I have to come up with different solutions for how you Sims can get to the next floor, because my builds are usually intended for gameplay, and therefore I would like them to be functional and aesthetic at the same time, which is not always that easy. So I put a lot of effort into that, especially into playtesting, to make sure everything works for you guys. So if you guys downloaded this house or plan on downloading this or any of my builds, I would really appreciate it if you could leave a like, because it's the easiest way to support the channel. Also leave a comment if you have any type of feedback or criticism for me. But now back to the video. So as you can see, I started furnishing the living room area here. So as you can see, at this point, the dining table was basically next to the living room, which was a weird space because the kitchen is across the room, and I wanted to have the dining table closer to the kitchen area, which I guess makes sense because you don't have to walk across the room. Also, there wasn't much space between the lounge chairs here, so I decided to move the dining table instead and create some kind of small reading nook where the dining table used to be. And at this point I was looking for decorations to use in the house. I feel like it's not very common to have these huge open spaces. For example, we have a completely open first floor here, except for the small room behind the staircase, which I ended up removing later on. So I think it's not a very realistic floor plan for the first floor, but I want to keep it open since the house is not that big, and I feel like it's also more convenient for gameplay. If you go upstairs, it's the other way around, which we'll see later on. We have a lot of rather small rooms, which are kind of oddly sized, but everything works. You will see it later on, and I feel like it fits the general aesthetic of this house. But for the first floor here, I wanted to have a more open area, as you can see, and this is the reading nook I was talking about earlier. I feel like the bay window makes sense here, even though I wanted the dining table to be in front of the bay window just to have some natural light in there, since we don't have any windows next to it now. But I feel like this is the best solution for this build. And as you can see here, I also readjusted the staircase just because this way we have a bit more space here which also makes sense since the house is not very big. And as I said before, adjusting staircases inside of the house is pretty annoying, and I would recommend placing the staircases before anything else inside, or maybe also outside, because this way you have enough space to rotate and modify them. And because I changed the staircase, I also had to change the exterior of the house a bit more, because I moved the staircase, as you guys can see here. It's not a major change or anything, it just makes the house a bit smaller, because I removed the area here in the back behind the stairs, because it does make a lot of sense to have it here, and I expanded this kind of small, it's not really a patio area, but this small area here where you can walk along. And I didn't want a second patio in the back, so I just kept it like you see it here. But I added some more columns here, and also a railing, which you will see a bit later in the video. I also moved the chimneys a bit because they were clipping through the wall. I also had to rearrange some of the wall plants outside, and some of the plants you can see here because they were clipping through the wall. And I cut it out because it was not very interesting. So let's talk a bit about the layout. The small room you see here is the bedroom. This house has only one bedroom and it's intended for 2 Sims, so we have a double bed here, nothing more. I thought about adding a kid's room or an additional guest bedroom, but I usually build my houses for like 2 Sims. And I also want to have a study on this side of the house here, and the layout would have been just way too awkward to have an additional room here, which you will see in a minute, because I think rooms should be connected to the hallway and not to a different bedroom, and this was really hard here. And I ended up having a very slim, strange, awkward hallway leading to the study room. I mean, you could still use it as an additional bedroom if you want to. You would just have to change the interior, of course. You will see this study in a minute, but I feel like it's kind of strange because we have one door and then a second door just like 2 meters away. So I don't usually like using ceiling fans, but I think they are a nice touch here for some kind of house in the countryside. And I don't like them because I feel like they're a bit in the way. They're very annoying when you're building, and I think they're also visible in live mode all the time, so even when you zoom in they won't disappear, I think. And they also don't do anything in game, at least to my knowledge, so you can simply delete them if you don't like them, if you think they're in the way. So at this point I was looking for more decorations I could use here in the living room area and the dining room area. And as you can see, I have some items here which I wanted to use on the mantle of our fireplace here. And because the fireplace was sized down, I used the red shelf mod to place the objects on top of the mantle, so they're basically floating. If you're not familiar with this mod, you can use it to place objects at a certain height or on surfaces where no additional slots are available anymore. So for example here, I think this fireplace has like 3 or 4 slots, and as you can see I placed 5 objects next to each other here, even 6 now, which you can't usually do. And this way you can also place objects that usually can't be placed on top of surfaces, so this is also helpful for using these objects in places where they usually can't be placed. For example, I sized down this plant here in the back, which you can see right now, and placed it on top of the books, which are placed on top of the mantle, which you can't usually do without any mods. So I also recommend getting the red shelf mod. I'm gonna link it in the description below. It's very easy to use once you get used to it, and for those who are new to the channel, as I said before, it's also in the description below. So there's no TV in this house because I didn't want to have one, and there wasn't really any space to place it after I finished furnishing the living room area here. I mean, if you really wanted to have one here, you could remove the wall decoration above the fireplace and use a wall-mounted television here, but I don't think it's really necessary. I'm also not sure if it fits the aesthetic of this build, so I simply didn't place one. So this is the back area of the house. Nothing too special going on here. I simply used the tool mod to lower these mossy stone walls into the ground, and then I placed some of these stone fence posts here and connected them by using a stone wall, which I also sized down. And afterwards I used a lot of plants, mainly hedges, to kind of make it look a bit more overgrown. We have a small garden area in the back here to the left side, which we're gonna add later on in the video. It's also functional, so you can use it for gameplay if you want to, but there's not that much interesting stuff going on here, also because this area is very small. As you can see, we only have this like 2-meter gap here between the house and the back stone wall, and as you can see here, I added some of these hedges to make it look a bit more natural and cover up the stone walls a bit, and continue the overgrown theme that we have going on here. I also used these small shrubs here to simulate a climbing plant, like some kind of, I'm not sure, it's not really ivy looking, but I feel like it looks very nice here. And I used this plant a lot for the build. I used it on the roof, I used it on the walls, and I used it here for this arch, so it just looks very nice. And it's also free because it's a debug object, so the price stays low no matter how many of these you use for your build, because with some plants, especially flowers, the house can get quite expensive after a while. So the finished build costs around 120,000 simoleons, which is probably nowhere near what a house like this would cost in real life. And I feel like the Sims prices are just so random, because small houses can be very expensive and really big houses can be quite cheap in comparison. Same goes for certain objects. They are very expensive and some are very cheap in comparison. So it's kind of hard to estimate the final cost of your build, but I guess that's part of the game. So this is the small hallway I mentioned before, which leads to the study, and I also cut out the portion where I divided these rooms because it was a very long process. I had to figure out where to put what. I also thought about having the study here, which is just ridiculously small, so I moved it to the back. And since I also wanted to have a bigger bathroom, I extended the small 2x2 room here with the tub here by one, as you can see here, so we have some additional space in this room. And I think the house looks also a bit nicer because we have this complex arrangement of roofs here, which took me a while to figure out, because it's very hard to work with roofs in The Sims. It's rather complicated, not necessarily to place them or anything, just to place them in a way that they look good. And this is the small gardening area I was talking about previously. As you can see, we have some planter pots here, nothing too fancy, but they should be functional in your game for like growing some herbs or other plants. So this is the only bedroom in the house. As I said before, this house is for 2 Sims. This room doesn't have a lot of features, it's just the bed and 2 nightstands, but I connected it to the small tower to the left, where we have a 2x2 area which I used as a walk-in closet. Currently there is this globe in there which I moved to the study room, which you will see in a moment, but I use this area for storage, as I said before, for clothing. And I feel like this is kind of necessary because I think this room is 4x3 and there is not a lot of space here. I'm not sure if a dresser would even fit in this room, so I guess it makes sense to have a walk-in closet here. So through the walk-in closet you can also access the highest level of the tower here, because I placed the ladder inside. There was no other place to put it, because in the small 2x1 hallway you see to the left, it would lead outside and there would be a hole in your balcony area here. So I had to move it inside the tower, of course, to access the top level of the tower here. Again, this build is playtested and fully functional, and I made sure that everything works. If you encounter any problems nonetheless, please feel free to leave a comment on this video here or on the gallery. So here I kind of created a custom window. It's not really anything special, but I used several of these as time goes by windows here, which have this very nice mesh-like structure, and I really wish we would get more windows like this one here. So because I had to resize the windows, we had some gaps in the wall, because as you probably know, windows are not designed to be resized in any way, and so I had to cover these gaps with the pillars here and also with the bookshelf. And this worked surprisingly well. I really like how it looks, so it's a nice touch as well. I'm also very pleased that I got to use these windows here because they look very nice and I couldn't find any other place to put them. Also, I really like that I could place more windows on the front of the house because it was looking a bit plain on this side. And I think this is how most people build. They have a general idea and then they start adding more and more objects to the build. Kind of trying to figure out what fits the aesthetic. Sometimes I want to use certain objects which I'm sure will fit the build, but I end up removing them eventually because they don't go together with the rest of the objects anymore. So I've been a builder for a while now, and I think at this point I know which objects from base game especially go together, and which makes it a bit easier to furnish and build with base game only. But I also discover new combinations, for example the window area here, which I think looks quite unique, and I think using cheats is a valid way to expand the possibilities in this game, because if you don't have, for example, move objects or debug cheats, you're very limited in what you can build, at least in my opinion, which kind of makes sense because this way it's ensured that less experienced players will have functional houses. And I think it's also valid that cheats are included for all the people out there who want to overcome the limitations of the regular game. And I personally like to come up with new ideas as well, where you use some of the objects in an unconventional way. And there are a lot of talented people out there who utilize the possibilities of cheating in this game for creating very impressive functional and also non-functional builds, which I think is also valid because some builds are just intended to be eye candy. So just in case you're new to the channel, most of my builds are functional. I usually state somewhere in the description if they're functional or non-functional, and this way people can decide whether they want this build or not, because I know people download my builds for different purposes. Some just want to look at them, some want to play with them, some want to use them for storytelling, some want to renovate them, so it's always up to what you guys want to do with the builds. So at this point I wanted to ask you guys, how many Sims do you usually have in your households, and if I should build houses with more bedrooms for more Sims, which is not really my style because my builds are usually small to medium size. But I also have two very large builds sitting in my gallery, which I'm gonna upload soon, so if you're interested in that, make sure you're subscribed if you're new to the channel. But now let's talk a bit more about this build here. So I used these wooden wall-mounted shelves here to create some kind of crown molding, which I'm not sure is the right term here, but this way I was able to add some three-dimensional structure to the wall here and some additional detail, which I think looks very nice. So I finished this house before they introduced painted ceilings, and so I added the painted ceilings after recording the video, of course, because as I said before, the house was already finished before they introduced painted ceilings to base game. So when I read about painted ceilings, I was really surprised because I didn't think they would ever introduce them, just because the game has been out for so many years now and they didn't bother introducing it before, especially because it doesn't seem like it was a lot of work to introduce it, because you apply it just like flooring and then it's on the ceiling. And personally I think it was really time that they introduced it, because when I paint the room I usually also paint the ceiling in the same color, and I don't have a plain white ceiling. And what was even more infuriating for me was that the shade of white the ceiling had was nothing like any other white we had in the game. It just looked odd all the time, and I really appreciate that we can use other materials as well, for example wood or stone, to make rooms more interesting or unique. So I also wanted to have more trees around the build, but there wasn't really any space, so I simply placed the tree on the roof here because we already had some plants, some shrubs here. And while I was building I tried to come up with how the tree could have gotten up here, and I think the most likely explanation would be that some animal carried a seed up here and it simply started growing, and the owners of the house simply didn't bother removing it or wanted to keep it because they liked it there. But I think if this was a real house, the tree would be rather problematic and a danger to the structural integrity of the building. But since this is not a real house, there's no real problem here, and if you guys don't want it, simply remove it. At this point the build was almost finished. I simply added some more decorations, some more clutter here and there, and I also finished the exterior area of this build by adding some more grass, some more shrubs, rearranging some of the objects and applying a lot of terrain paint. And I cut that out because I think it's not very interesting and also not really necessary for the video here, especially since it's already quite long. So if you watched the video until this point, I wanted to say thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please leave a like. It's the easiest way to support the channel. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. Also leave a comment if you have any type of feedback for me, which also helps with the algorithm. Again, thank you guys for watching, and now here's the finished build. See you guys next time. Peace out.